Welcome back to Insight Indonesia, brought to you by the Jakarta Globe. Today I'm talking with Andrew White, the Managing Director of AmCham Indonesia, and we're talking about investment climate and some of the things that need to be done. In the last segment we talked about the mining regulations, which is something that we all talk about and we don't get anywhere on yet. But what about infrastructure? What are some of the things that you're seeing? What are some of the positive things that we're seeing on infrastructure?
Well, I think some of the positive things that we're seeing is that there's more dialogue in that area. Clearly, I think from the Indonesian government side, there's a recognition that infrastructure is getting in the way of investment. And there's a real opportunity cost, simply because many companies, that's what they look as they invest in today. So if companies don't see that, they're not going to invest. So I think the dialogue is there. With the Chamber, what we're doing today, in fact, is we're working with the Indonesian associations, KADN and APindo, KIKAS, and the U.S. government and the Indonesian government to talk about issues related to infrastructure. And so bringing the private sector into that discussion, there's a willingness on both the U.S. government side and the Indonesian government side. That's the way forward. It's government at the speed of business. And when you get that right, I think these issues can be resolved. Is
there sufficient appetite within the Indonesian system for the kind of public-private partnerships that might bring big U.S. investors into infrastructure with all that expertise?
I think there is, because I think, if I can be frank with you, I think, when you talk about these big public-private partnerships, cost is a factor. And I think there's been a learning curve that the people involved in that on the government side have come, that you have to look at the total life cycle of a project. And what American companies bring to the table is the technology. It might cost more on the front end, but it's going to work. And the service that comes in over the life of a project that's 10, 20, 30 years, no one does that like American companies. And I do believe that as this is moving forward, there's more of a recognition that the American companies have the technology, they have the service orientation, and that ultimately brings down the costs over time.
But one of the other factors, of course, that we get in terms of infrastructure, certainly in Jakarta, is the inability to coordinate projects as well, which I find fascinating. I was talking to the guy who's going to build the new port, and I said, who's going to build the roads? He says, I don't know. I'm going to build the port. And somebody better build that road.
Right.
It's probably not a bad strategy, but it really points up the fact that you can't get them both. You seemingly can't get all of them done at the same time.
Well, the simple model is bring everyone to the table and do it. And in fact, I think that's the model, if I could say, that maybe the Indonesian government has looked at in the past. Somebody comes in and says, I'll do it all.
I'll do everything.
And it sounds very reassuring. But the challenge is, does it work? And I think that we have to get that model right. I think where the American companies come in is they'll say, I'll do the road, and they will do the road. But the question is, how do you bring the other parts together? Now, the Exim Bank, the U.S. government financed, and have the institutions today, and that's the dialogue. How do you bring the banks to the table, along with the companies, along with the financing arm? And the U.S. government, AmCham, and the private sector are trying to look at that. How can we bring the pieces together?
And are you confident that there's a willingness and openness to deal with U.S. and U.S. government on that level? I know the relationship has gotten much better in recent years.
I'm cautiously optimistic, let's put it that way. I think there is a willingness, but it takes time. And I think the commercial dialogue process, the comprehensive partnership that the U.S. government has signed with Indonesia, bringing in the private sector is the way forward. It takes a commitment, and there are no quick wins on this thing. It takes time. And there's an opportunity cost if it's not gotten right now.
Now, getting to your organization, getting to AmCham, this is obviously a private sector group working in a lot of policy issues, also helping with companies who want to invest here and do business here. How do you define the role of AmCham or a high-level chamber of commerce in these kinds of discussions, in this policy environment?
Well, our role, and I come from 30 years in the private sector, the key is to get a seat at the table. And if I look at chambers, because I do come from the private side, I think there may be a tendency at times to talk too much to ourselves. So we're in Indonesia. So one of our first priority needs to be talking to the Indonesians. And that means linking up, talking to organizations like Kadin, Apindo, and Indonesian businesses, and bringing American companies to that table, because that's how you get the right dialogue together, and that's how you begin to change the dynamic here.
Yeah, because I've known AmChams in some other countries, and there is sometimes a tendency to think of it as an American ghetto. And so what you're saying is you want to break through that and make it be more of a shared thing.
I think so. That's the only way to do it, because if we talk to ourselves, we'll all agree. But what we need to do is bridge that gap. We need to sit down with our Indonesian colleagues, both in the private and the public sector, and try to see things from their perspective, because that's how you begin to change the dynamic. And
is this a new direction for AmCham? Is this what you're here to do?
Well, the board, the Board of Governors sat back last year. They had a strategy review meeting. Our mission is to be the advocate for American business. And what we've got going for us is we're here in Indonesia 24/7. We've got the talent, we've got the experience, and the question is, how do you leverage that, bring its full potential? So that's the way forward.
Well, what we're going to talk about in the last segment is some of the activities that AmCham is undertaking, and some of the nuts and bolts, and also perhaps how some of our viewers can get involved if they want to join AmCham or become part of this undertaking. You're watching Insight Indonesia, brought to you by the Jakarta Globe. I'm with Andrew White, the Managing Director of AmCham here in Indonesia. Stay with us.